Okay. Hello, everybody who's coming in. Welcome, welcome. We'll start in a few minutes. It's good to see. Welcome, welcome to session number 5, I believe. Yep, session number 5. Give us a wave. Let me know how we're sounding before we kick off and stuff. If we're good, if you can hear us. Thank you, Charlotte. Yes, Lindsay, appreciate that ever. Yep, nice. That's good. And also give us a wave if you've attended all 4 previous sessions as well. Let's see who are the diehard fans. Okay, Charlotte, good. Yeah, big up Lindsay. Yeah, Emma. All right, a few of you. That's brilliant. Thank you so much. And let us know how you find them. It's really good. So we'll just wait a few minutes just to give people an opportunity. We've actually opened the doors a few minutes early. So, you know, we don't want to miss out on any opportunities. Let us know where you're from as well in the chat. It's always nice to get an idea of where people are from. So yeah, in the chat, let us know where you're from. Let us know the type of stuff you're doing as well. Whether you're working in the field or you're just observing. It's always good just to know. So yeah, let us know what you're about. Exeter, wow, Exeter, that is far from where I am, man. That is far. Northwest London, equally as far from me. I'm South London. You don't go to North. I'm only joking. North is cool. South London, big up ever. I'm here for the first time and may not be able to stick around. I am from Manchester, 5 Project. Nice to see you. Newcastle, nice one, Megan. Norfolk, Karen Ann, nice one. Dawn, Bedford Borough, okay. Southampton, Learning Observer, that's all good. Everyone's here to learn. So fantastic. It's really good. We'll give it a few moments before we kick off, and I'll just do a short intro and I'll hand over to our speaker from the Children's Society representing East London all the way. Wow, that's a hard, that's, you know, I'm back in my area. Nice one, Natasha. Norfolk Inside Out coach. Lovely, lovely. We'll give it a few more minutes and then we'll crack in. School pastors, Billericay. Okay, nice one. Essex Children and Families pastor. Lovely. Social enterprise teaching proactive workshops on safe sex, drugs, rock and roll. Rock and roll, you know, okay. Mainly knife crime, ASB and cyberbullying. Nice one. Good to see you all again. Thank you for coming. Brilliant, brilliant. Hey, Nicole. This is good. Okay, we'll give it a few moments and then we'll hand over. Let me just put up the other screen, actually. Hold on a second. That's not the one. Okay, that's cool. Leave that one up. Okay, welcome to everybody. We're just giving it a few more moments. It's only 2 minutes past. We'll give it to about 5 past and then we'll crack on because this is only an hour session and we really want to make sure that you guys get everything which our guest speaker will be blessing us with today. It's great. We've got 65 people in the building at the moment, which is really good. We've had it, overall, we've had over 450 people sign up and each session has been really well attended by over 70 people. So yeah, we expect this one to be no different. Okay, working with young people in our communities, education settings in order to encourage positive behaviour and positive role models. Great. An NHS assistant practitioner for a healthy child programme. Lovely. Thank you very much, Nicola. Okay. Lovely to meet you, Emily, founder of Open Doors. Nice one, Kerry. Young People's Sexual Health Service, Croydon. Big up Croydon in the area. Likewise, nice one. Social workers, brilliant. Lovely to meet you, Annette. Exploitation prevention officer. Okay, nice one, Megan. Welcome, everyone. Caseworker, care for ex-offenders, HTB. Nice, did some work with HTB over the last week. Hi, Ben, is there an option where I can access my mic? Seems that you have restricted video audio. Is this a type only session? Yeah, this is a webinar, so the only way that you'll be able to speak is if I allow you to. And basically what we're going to be doing is there'll be Q&As. So let's, okay, I'm going to start the session and I can give a little bit of housekeeping. Okay, so welcome to session 5 of our COVID-19 isolation and young people's training conference. This conference is sponsored by the City Bridge Trust. And as I said, this is number 5. We've had some great sessions so far. All those sessions, if you've missed any, they're on our YouTube site. So just search Power to Fight, and that's on our YouTube site. And we've had some great sessions so far. Today, we have got a good friend of mine, somebody who I've worked with and had known for over 10 years. And in my opinion, is one of the best practitioners, minds on this issue, just around young people, keeping them safe, engaging with everything which young people are going through in this particular time. A guy who needs no introduction, a guy called Craig Pinkney, and he's going to be looking at how do you keep young people safe. But just before we crack into that, what I want to do is just make a few things clear. So Craig's going to be talking for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll do some Q&A. You all seem to be sensible, professional people, but anything where we look at and we think this is not helpful, anything we see in the chat, I will just politely remove you. So everybody keep it polite, but we have no problem with you asking hard or difficult questions. We do not offend easily. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Craig, who will introduce himself and crack on. So I'm going to stop sharing, Craig, and feel free to upload what you need to do.
Give me a second. Can you see me?
Yeah, mate. Lovely.
Good. Ready to roll? Brilliant. Okay, everybody, I've only got 45 minutes, so I'm going to try my best to stick to Ben's time. I know that Ben's going to be messaging me like, Craig, you need to wrap it up. You know that I can talk all day, every day, because I love to talk to my fellow professionals. And ultimately, just thank you for Power to Fight for inviting me to have this conversation, because we nationally, globally are faced with some really interesting questions that we need to be, I guess, answering, which is a lot different to some of the things that we've been responding to before. But as we are in the middle of an epidemic, COVID-19, I thought it makes sense that we kind of have a conversation that talks specifically about we as youth work professionals, as members that work within communities, and how we can engage with young people much better. And I will try my best, as I said, to fly through my slides, because I want to give the opportunity for people to fire questions. I can't see your questions whilst I'm doing my PowerPoint presentation. So if you can just reserve your questions to the end, and I will try my best to answer them as quick as possible. But just as a quick formal introduction for those that have never met me or seen me before, I'm sure you noticed the Birmingham accent, so Craig Pinkney. So I guess essentially I'm a criminologist. I kind of think and seek to understand, to answer the most important question that people ask is why? Why do young people do what they do? Why do young people behave in a particular way? And how can we, as members of the community, key stakeholders, professionals, those that are in positions of power around the country from different entities, how can we engage with young people better? In terms of my background, so I'm a youth work professional. I'm a JNC qualified youth worker, 16 years experience working in a range of different settings, managing a number of organizations, especially within the youth service, and lots of statutory organizations. I guess the last probably 6 years or so, I've gone into more academic type of stuff, where I've now started to kind of create a series of methodologies and approaches to engage with children and young people that are affected by violence and conflict in a range of different ways to assist ultimately youth work professionals that engage with young people. In terms of kind of my advisory roles, I advise the Crown Prosecution Service, support the National Youth Agency, as well as the Police and Crime Commission in the West Midlands, violent reduction units up and down the country, and in terms of some of my international work for the Ministry of Justice in the Caribbean. And I guess ultimately just to kind of bring the kind of human element to all of this is that I'm a dad. So other than being called all of these titles, I get called Dad 24/7. I can hear my daughter in the background, and I'm hoping that they remain quiet whilst I'm doing today's presentation. And I guess in a nutshell, for those that know me, my slogan is bridging the gap between academia and the streets, that we're able to understand and ascertain a series of updated, contemporary methodologies, and how can we relate that into engaging with young people. And ultimately, that's what I want to kind of demonstrate today, how youth work practice is essential, can be essential, and historically actually has been quite effective when we're talking about engaging with young people. So going back to my previous point about being an academic, these are just a few publications that I've either authored or co-authored, which I'm going to be talking about in a nutshell. And I think it's important now that we just kind of set the scene. So again, we're talking about a current scenario that we're faced with, where children and young people, in terms of their vulnerabilities, have increased. And how are we supposed to engage? How are we supposed to keep young people safe? And I want to kind of talk about some of the issues that have risen during COVID-19, but also talk about what's going to happen after. And I think when we talk about setting the scene, many youth work professionals that are in the audience today will understand that we've predicted a lot of these things 10, 11 years ago. If you remember when David Cameron first put out that first government report, the Ending Gang and Youth Violence report, it didn't just speak specifically about gangs, but it spoke about a series of things in relation to cutbacks and what that was going to look like in terms of what was happening with young people. So when we now talk about the rise in gun crime, the rise in knife crime, the rise in domestic violence, the rise in adverse childhood experiences of children and young people, we could have said 11 years ago, we would have predicted that this was going to happen in 2020 and beyond. But now we've got COVID-19, that just kind of exacerbates some of the issues. So just to kind of reinforce what I've just said as just kind of a visual, these are the things that many of us, depending on what organization that we work for, these were the things that we were ultimately trying to attack and engage from our understanding and from our practice. So with some of us were working in communities and engaging with issues around poverty, engaging with issues around education, or working for children's services and family support. Some of us were doing work around responding to situations around trauma. But then some of the key things that we were faced with in terms of the challenges is that we were faced with organizations and entities having the same interactions, same interventions that they were ultimately using, that ultimately by default was not preventing or reducing the issues that we were faced with. And then there's also an issue around staff competency. And I'm very hot about talking about this in my work, that many of us are very passionate about working with children and young people. But I always ask the fundamental question, do you understand the context of where young people are at in 2020 and beyond? Because many of us were trained as youth workers. I remember I graduated in 2005 as a youth worker. But the information that I got in 2005, is that relevant in 2020? And I would arguably say no, because things have changed, especially when we're talking about culture, technology, and all of those different things change the way in which what we call youth cultures actually start to diversify. And if we are not utilizing models and approaches to engage young people in a contemporary context, then how are we supposed to be reducing these problems that we're just mentioning? And then we can talk about some of the issues nationally. When we're talking about damaged relationships between the police, we're talking about issues now. If you look globally, the conversation is back on the table about racism. I'm not sure why it's been removed from the conversation. And I know that even Ben has written a book. I think people haven't got it if you haven't, but this is a book and I thought it's really interesting to read. Let's Talk About Race. But the point that I'm making is that there are fundamental systemic issues that are impacting our society. So before we even talk about some of the key things that are around solutions, I always say it's important that we talk about at least some of the challenges to our work. So we know that coronavirus has increased the vulnerabilities of children and young people nationally. There's a number of government reports that have been released during COVID-19, some that I've been a part of, that speak specifically about what's happening with young people in education, young people that are out of education, young people that are in pupil referral units, young people that haven't been in education, young people that are coming out of prison, young people that are suffering from mental health, young people that are under children's services. And all of those different vulnerabilities has increased and intensified some of the issues that post-COVID-19 is going to make our jobs much more difficult. And I think one of the biggest concerns for me is that we are now having conversations in week 13 about how we should respond to children and young people that are affected by those issues. And we should have been having this conversation 14, 15 weeks ago. And it's kind of that same kind of cycle as a reactive intervention. So if you know nationally, they're throwing out funding left, right, and center now to engage with issues of young people during COVID-19, where this conversation should have been taking place from the end of last year when the alert around COVID-19 and the spread of this pandemic was announced globally. So when we talk about specific concerns about children and young people around how do they keep safe, key things that I just want to talk about. So we're talking about young people, specifically during lockdown, that are engaging in a range of different activities, not that are new, but more different in the context that we're in the middle of a pandemic and young people are still out and about, engaging as if there isn't something taking place within our society. And then when we look at some of the kind of key things that ultimately come out, these are what the vulnerabilities are in a nutshell. So we're talking about young people and their increased mental health problems. What are we talking about? We're talking about young people, obviously, during COVID-19. Many of them are staying in their household because of lockdown, don't understand the context of the lockdown, and people are living on top of each other. You know, when you just look at even us as adults, you know, people have fell out with their partners, people have fell out with their siblings, people have fell out with their children, because people are in a situation that we've never been in before, where we're having to stay in and follow specific government guidelines. And as a consequence, you know, all of the social interactions that we were once used to, going to the gym, socializing, going to restaurants, just being able to go to the park as frequent as we used to has been limited. So obviously by default, we're talking about young people that have increased mental health problems. And I think that part of that may be also a reason why we've seen so many young people out and about. And I just want to quickly make that point that when we talk about young people's increased vulnerabilities, because they're out and about doesn't mean that they're out and about because they're involved or want to be involved in some aspect of criminality. We know that young people are missing from education. So whilst those increased vulnerabilities around education, when we look at organized criminality, for example, county lines, we know that young people that are generally outside of school are now more vulnerable than they was before. At risk at being home, as I just previously mentioned, we're talking about domestic violence, domestic abuse, and there's a lot of young people that have had to witness those particular scenarios inside of their household, and school would have been a safe haven. The youth center would have been a safe haven. The local charity organization would have been a safe haven. The local church, the local mosque, the local temple, any activity outside of their household potentially would have been a safe haven for children that may have been witnessing or experiencing a series of difficulties as it relates to issues around being at risk at home. So it's also talking about a digital divide. And what do I mean by that? We're talking about young people that have versus the young people that don't. So again, my children have access to the internet 24/7. We have Wi-Fi, they have tablets, they have smartphones that they can engage online with their teachers, with their friends. But what about those communities that live on the poverty line? What about those children that don't have the access? And again, where they would have been engaging in education, where they've been engaging with organizations or entities that would have provided access to those things, we're now going to see a reduction. And these are the conversations that are happening nationally. So where the government may be having conversations about, you know, how do young people, or how do we get young people back into school in September, we're talking about months of young people nationally that are not getting a proper education. And these are the things that, when we talk about adverse impacts on specific communities that generally come from social deprivation, communities that are living on the poverty line, ultimately it's always them that are adversely impacted. And then we're talking about risky behaviors. And as a consequence of those things that I've just previously mentioned, young people are taking some serious risks. So we know that young people nationally are going missing more than they ever did before. We know that young people have been victims or perpetrators of specific types of crimes different before. So those crimes have always existed, but again, the vulnerability enables individuals that groom, exploit different types of young people in a range of different ways. They have better access to our children and young people. And then also you got homelessness is a major issue, specifically, using my words, specifically within the West Midlands. We know that homelessness is a major issue. And I know that for people that are coming from different regions, know that homelessness is a major issue. So again, we're talking about a potential lockdown. And these are the unseen and unheard societies in our communities where individuals don't have a place of rest and are having to stay in other people's households. So when we then talk about the rise of COVID-19 in specific communities, we have to start asking more fundamental questions of the reasons why we start to see some of these statistics. And then also we know that self-harm has been an increase, which links to the first point around increased mental health problems. We're talking about young people having more suicidal thoughts, young people that are self-harming as a consequence or as an outlet because of the issues that they're currently faced with. So I think whilst we have those kind of conversations, I mean, many of us would also agree that when we're talking about government entities or national entities that claim to understand what's going on with children and young people, we are oftentimes put in a most difficult position because we're asked to respond to these particular issues. And as I just said previously, we are in week 13, 14, having conversations about how do we respond to children and young people when ultimately it's too late. So just to kind of reinforce some of the things that I've just been talking about, just more from a literature perspective, is that these are just some of the current pieces of literature that's been written during COVID-19 that kind of reinforces some of the stuff that I've just mentioned. I won't go through all of them, but if you just want to take a quick snapshot at what these things are, I think it's important. And one of the things I think is also very key, which I also stress in my work, is that, again, we can't just be passionate workers. We also need to be passionate workers with intellect. We need to be passionate workers that have intellect based on some of the upcoming things that are presented by children and young people. And a lot of these reports take the voices of children and young people and enable us to better understand what the potential solutions can be to engage with their problems. And I think ultimately, as a visual, what these publications are kind of indicating is this one thing, that it's creating a cycle. And for those of you that are familiar with my work, I talk about this idea about a criminal justice pipeline. Some of you are more familiar with the concept of the school to prison pipeline. It kind of follows the same methodology. And I'm saying, based on those increased vulnerabilities of children and young people nationally, we can understand why young people are feeling more and more marginalized, why they feel more alienated within our society. And as a consequence of that alienation or marginalization, where they feel that they're separate from our society, we know that organizations are not responding. We know that we are being told that we can't respond during COVID-19 because of government guidelines. So it's no coincidence that we see a rise in young people joining more deviant groups. As I said in my previous point, we're talking about vulnerabilities being increased and organized criminals exploiting that fact. So young people know that whilst there's an increased vulnerability and they want the things in life, the material things that they want, they're going to join subgroups as a self-defense, self-sustaining mechanism in order to ensure that their needs are ultimately met. So when they join deviant groups, and I put that specifically because I didn't want to just focus on gangs, we're talking about any type of group that's going to provide young people's needs. But oftentimes, and the issue is that the groups that young people join in that are deviant, they become involved in criminality. And then we're talking about a system, organizations, institutions, professionals as a whole thinking that there's only one solution to engage a problem when individuals or groups of individuals engage in particular deviant behaviors, how to respond to that. So what do we hear about? Lock people up, put them into secure if they're children, put them into a YOI or mental health services. Now, intervention alone versus punitive measures, meaning prison, we already know what those debates ultimately are, and we don't have to go into that. Meaning in summary that punitive measures and punitive measures alone, locking people up, doesn't solve the problem. But then what we have is a cycle, because we know children and young people that go through these particular systems at some point in time are going to be returned back to our community, and they're going to feel more marginalized, more alienated. So where our society become more and more disorganized, because I said in the beginning, we're still using old methodologies to engage with children and young people, communities and members of the community in the same particular way. So what the young people do, they join the cycle again, and it just becomes a repeated cycle over and over and over again. And all social media does is exacerbate everything that I've just mentioned. So we're talking about the big illusion, young people following individuals, entities, whether they're celebrities, whether they're people in their local communities that advertise and promote the same type of narrative, that in order to make it in a society where there's deprivation, where there's lack of opportunity, where there's social unrest, these are the ways that you can get the things ultimately in society. So if you're involved in fraud, if you're involved in some aspects of criminality, if you're involved in selling drugs, if you're involved in going OT out of town, county lines, this is the only way that you're going to achieve all of these things, which makes our jobs 10 times worse, because now we have to respond to this. So any youth worker or any professional that works with young people would agree that this is our challenge. Despite all of the systemic problems that we've been talking about, the poverty, the racism, the trauma, the adverse childhood experiences, and so on and so forth, this is our big dragon, because we know that whilst young people are utilizing social media, specifically during COVID-19, Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, TikTok, House Party, using all of these different types of platforms to engage with young people even more than they did before, because there's nothing for else to do. Those individuals that are going to exploit young people utilize those same particular platforms to engage young people and advertise these things. But we never really have the conversation about what is the role of Rolex, what is the role of Range Rover, what is the role of Nike, what is the role of Chanel, Dior, Louis Vuitton, and all of these different brands that advertise and market the same brands to children and young people during lockdown. But what we often do is focus on individuals that exploit them for a range of different things. And then we've got music and the way in which young people utilize social media platforms in order to amplify their issues and their conflicts that they have. So one of the things that we've also noticed during COVID-19, specifically in the West Midlands, and it's different to every single region, whereas one region, you may notice that issues around knife crime is reduced, but you may go to a different region and knife crime has been on the increase. So if I use as an example as the West Midlands, gun crime has gone up, because there's a number of issues that have happened where young people realize that during the lockdown, it's actually easier to find their ops. It's actually easier to find their enemies, because they know there's generally going to be at 2 or 3 locations: their house, their mum's house, their girlfriend's or their nan's. And whilst they know that, what's starting to happen is that there's a number of properties in local communities that have been shot at and shut up, where there's vulnerable people in those households. And when I mean by vulnerable people, we're talking about children, younger children that are in households, which again goes back to the original point around increased vulnerabilities of children and young people. So whilst we know that social media is exacerbating all of the issues that we're talking about, it's more important about understanding those audiences, because if we're talking about keeping young people safe, we have to understand who's involved and who are those that are interacting on these social media platforms. So who are the audience? And oftentimes the audience, when we're talking about conflict on social media platforms, the audience generally ain't individuals that the people that are projecting particular narratives. The audience oftentimes are not the people that they're beefing with or in conflict with. Those individuals in the audience are the regular, everyday young person those same impressionable young people that even maybe our children, our nieces, our nephews, our neighbors that are at home and bored. And whilst they're looking at these big illusions, they're also looking at internet conflicts and beefs, and oftentimes are commenting, liking, involving themselves in situations that oftentimes has nothing to do with them. And as a consequence of that, there's been a number of situations in local communities where young people have been stabbed and young people have been shot during COVID-19 whilst they're walking in local communities. Because when beef is amplified on a social media platform, what we then start to see here is that manifests into the physical world, meaning someone posts a meme, somebody posts a video, someone posts something of a disrespect where an individual feels that they need to respond to that. And as I'm saying again, during lockdown, it's actually easier to actually drive around and look for people that you actually might have conflict with. And as a consequence of that, if you think about the points that I've just made about young people not being in their household because of issues that they may be faced with whilst they're at home, unfortunately by default, they potentially can become victims to the same conflicts that may exist between gangs, groups that are at rivals with each other. And for me, that is a major concern, because then we have young people that are not necessarily involved in any form of criminality that by default are becoming victims to a wider system of violence. And whilst those increased vulnerabilities rise, for those same young people, they become victims on top of those issues that I've just presented. So when we talk about increased mental health issues, when we talk about the fact that young people are self-harming and young people are wanting to commit suicide, we can understand in context why those things are ultimately happening. So then the question that you all should be asking is, well, Craig, what is the solution? What are the ways in which we can engage young people much better? And I always say, and a famous criminologist always said this, that sometimes before we even talk about the solutions, it's important that we talk about our challenges, because when we understand what our challenges are, it will help us then in order to engage with the current climate of the situations more effectively. So one of the things that I always talk about as it relates to youth work is that youth work historically has always been a science and art that has always been one in which responds to the needs or the ills of any society. So we can go as far as the 16th and 17th century when we're talking about youth work when it first was birthed. It wasn't called youth work in that particular context, but the way in which adults, professionals engage with children and young people to engage with those systemic problems that society were faced with. Again, talking about poverty, deprivation, poor education, so on and so forth. And I say in modern days is that youth work has become like that hidden science, that hidden art that people have forgot about. So when people say, oh, they work with young people, I question what do they mean in context? Because when we talk about youth work as a philosophy, as a science, as an art, it's key things that youth workers do that's very different to the way that a lot of organizations that claim that they work with children and young people do very different. So we know that youth work as a philosophy, as a foundation, has always been based around informal education. It's never been formal. It's always been spontaneous, meaning that we meet children and young people where they're at. It's always been versatile in the way in which they work with different types of young people in a different context, working with young people and utilizing a range of different holistic approaches. So mentoring is not just one way that you engage with young people. Having young people in a center, playing table tennis is not one way. There's multiple ways, because you know as a youth worker, you actually use a different types of approaching. Why? Because we know that children and young people come with baggage, whether that's to do with culture, whether that's to do with likes or dislikes, whether that's to do with their spiritual religious beliefs, whether that's to do with their political beliefs, whether that's to do with issues that they're faced with or impacted at home, their psychological, their physiological needs. We know as youth workers that we've always engaged with young people a range of different ways, and we don't focus too much on systems, we just get on with it. But one of the things that we recognize is that we can't physically change the lives of young people, rather that we recognize that our tool and our most powerful tool is conversation. So when individuals are trained through youth work, we're trained in different skills around emotional intelligence. the individual things around understanding young people and building trust and building those relationships. To understand that, we use negotiation skills, mediation skills, and a range of different ways to engage with young people. Going back to my previous point, in context, where young people are at, meeting them where they're at in terms of their needs. But these are the challenges, and this is the reason why youth work isn't working in the current climate. Why? Because new political agendas are distorting the focus on youth violence. So, for example, the focus is everything other than COVID-19, looking at things like extremism, looking at other aspects, but not really focusing on how youth workers can assist and engage young people in the right and appropriate way. And most of these political agendas, if you've noticed, are calling for more punitive measures as a response to deal with the issues that are faced by young people. So what we find is that through those particular processes, criminal justice entities creates more distrust within local communities, and young people that feel that they're in a hostile environment that's followed by hostile policies. And then oftentimes we, as those youth workers, are called in to reinforce some of those hostile policies, and then that distrust between then us and the community then oftentimes becomes an issue. And I think that one of the things that we can agree on is this idea about funding. Funding is a major issue at the minute. That smaller pots of funding oftentimes to engage organizations that are generally grassroots organizations that are working on the ground, and limited funding is given to them to deal with unrealistic outcomes. So if you're giving organizations between $3,000 to $20,000 to engage in issues around adverse childhood experiences, when you think about how some entities are given $7,000, $10,000 a week to engage in one child, how are organizations on the front line supposed to engage effectively with children and young people in COVID-19 with all of the issues that I've just previously raised? And then there's a major issue around those well-established organizations that generally have that extensive experience in bid writing that oftentimes, unfortunately, by default become the gatekeepers for those real big pots of funding to respond to the issue of violence that's now erupting amongst our children and young people. And then I think one of the most important things I think that we don't talk about is the kind of change of understanding youth work practice. So if you've noticed that a lot of government organizations or statutory organizations as a whole nationally, over the last 10 years have kind of moved towards this idea of utilizing practitioners with what we call lived experience, as opposed to utilizing qualified youth workers. And as a belief that individuals that are coming from a lived experience are actually more better at engaging with young people with issues around extremism, issues around domestic violence, issues around risky behavior, county lines, so on and so forth. So whilst that idea of using people with lived experiences, there's a major problem with that, because lived experience alone, again, as I said in the beginning, with that intellect, and this is not insulting people's intelligence, but what I mean by that is having a foundation of youth work. And one of the things that I have found in my research, specifically within my PhD, is that a lot of people with lived experience, the only thing that they hold on to is a story, and assuming that that story is going to get children and young people and their families from A to B. And this is where youth work practice becomes really important, because not only does it borrow from lived experiences and also invites people with lived experiences, but it gives you the philosophy of youth work practice. It teaches those important things about building trust, building relationships. How do you build trust? How do you build relationships? How do you build credibility? How do you sustain those relationships within difficult environments where children, young people and their families are faced by a number of these issues? And that's why it's important. So until we return back to the original philosophy of youth work practice within communities, locally and nationally, these are the things that we're ultimately going to be faced with. And then finally, the lack of understanding of how youth work addresses issues faced by young people in the UK has created this narrative that youth work is only about table tennis and working with young people. And what I mean by that is, when you speak to generally people about what youth work is, they think that it's always been about just playing games. But again, as I just previously mentioned, all of those kind of unseen skills and building those relationships, helping young people find their new identities in a very democratic type of way, is most essential when we're talking about youth work practice. And again, one of the bigger challenges that's oftentimes, I guess, put in current times is, well, how are we supposed to engage with young people generally during COVID-19? But there's guidelines that are actually out there that actually assist us in order to do that. And it's important because I had a conversation this morning with a local practitioner that said that he's been working in conjunction with the local police. And they basically said that he shouldn't be doing any youth work. And I said, have you read this particular document that actually was supported by national government about how do we engage with young people in during times? And he was unaware of it. So rather than reading these documents, what we should be doing is utilizing these documents as almost like a lobbying tool to get people to answer questions to why. So what I would do locally is, if organizations are basically saying we shouldn't be engaging with young people, and there's actually research and documentation that's out there that gives us a very clear guideline how we can work with young people in a safe way while social distancing and following government guidelines. What I would be doing is utilizing these documents and asking the question, if we have these government guidelines supported by national agencies that are giving us very clear guidelines, why are you not allowing us to engage with children and young people in the current time? Because what's happening by default is that children's services are under pressure, mental health services are under pressure, law enforcement are under pressure, and communities as a whole are under pressure because they need people to engage with children and young people. And what the thinking has been is, unless there's funding to engage with children and young people in one particular way, we can't engage with young people. And what I'm saying is, there's actually very clear guidelines of how to engage with children and young people in a very safe way, utilizing these particular documents. And I'll answer any questions that kind of look at that. So we've got about 20 minutes, so I'm not gonna stress too long. So I'm gonna probably go on for about 5 more minutes, and then we're going to finish because I wanna allow you guys to have some questions. So one of the things I always talk about is, as a direct response to children and young people, these are fundamental questions that we as professionals need to be asking each other. And one of the first things is, what is your skill? What is your power? And one of the things I'm very hot on and I talk a lot about is staying within your lane. Very few times do I step out of my lane, because I know that my power is working with young people in one particular type of way, but always ensuring that I kind of adopt a range of different ways of engaging with children, young people in a contemporary sense. So one of the things that I always talk about is, if you're an individual that wants to engage with a young person or children or families within communities, you have to start asking questions about yourself. I call it the big mirror. Putting the big mirror in front of yourself and asking that fundamental question. Where do you stand politically? Where do you stand socially? Based on race, gender, sexuality, ability to engage with children and young people, because positionality is important. With the current climate and the conversation about race and white supremacy, institutional racism, and anti-racist practice that's been projected currently in this narrative around injustice globally, where do you stand in this conversation? Or is it just a thing that you hear as narratives and you emotionally feel a particular way but don't do anything with it? And just like working with children and young people, what is your position? How do you position yourself locally or nationally to engage with these particular issues? Because it's important that you have to start to ask those internal questions. Because one of the things that I always talk about is that understanding young people in present context. So when we're talking about meeting young people's needs in real time, in 2020, during COVID-19, what are we talking about? Because we need to now start to adopt new types of approaches. So many of us are aware of the person-centered approach, which kind of talks about this idea that you meet people where they're at, where individuals, communities, children or young people are at the center. And we recognize, as I previously said, that young people come with baggage. But I say maybe we need to now start looking at these particular issues from a critical race theorist approach. And what I mean by that is that now we start to look at these issues of children and young people through the lens of race, class, and gender. Because if we're not looking at things through the lens of race, class, and gender, what we're then doing is ignoring children and young people that come from specific communities. And I'll give one quick example. So many of us are aware of adverse childhood experiences and the model of adverse childhood experiences that basically talks about children and young people that have more adverse childhood experiences later on in life, ultimately experience a range of behaviors. Now, I would say, looking at adverse childhood experiences without looking at it through the lens of critical race theory, the lens of race, class, and gender, and so forth, then what you're doing is you're actually excluding children and young people that come from specific communities, because nowhere in that particular model talks about intergenerational trauma. None of that talks about trauma as it relates specifically to do with race and gender and sexuality. So when we have these conversations about looking at young people and their traumas, young people and their experiences, through what lens are we looking at it? So then that means that the approaches and the methodologies that predominantly we use to engage with children and young people is out of date, because generally it's used from a Eurocentric perspective, generally written by academics, individuals that come from the UK, come from parts of Europe, but it's not looked at from the lens of individuals of the other, the different. And I don't like to use the word BAME anymore, because I don't think it reflects different communities ultimately that are faced by the intergenerational traumas that I have just mentioned. So reflexivity is really important, because it's really about not just being about self-awareness, but it's also about looking at the lens of that young person, those children, those families, our wider communities, and how do they see the world through their lens, and then making that impact on the way that we then see the world. And connecting the two enables us to have that position that I've just mentioned, that enables us to come forward with different methodology and how we can engage. And that's the reason why, for many of those, in conclusion, I talk about my work around on-road youth work practice, because this is just one approach, one methodology that oftentimes is utilized in local communities to engage with young people in a range of different ways. And specifically what I say is, in current times, when we're talking about issues of extremism, county lines, young people with adverse childhood experiences, the rise of violence, gangs, so on and so forth, how we engage with young people in a different way. And I say, if we take the methodology of youth work practice and engage that with criminological thought, sociological thought, and make them intersect, it gives us a new way in how to engage with young people ultimately in real time. And what this is ultimately saying in a nutshell is that we function from an insider perspective. So if you're an individual that's going to be an on-road youth worker, or an individual that's going to connect to the streets in real time, it means that you can't really function from your desk. It means that you can't talk to young people from your ivory tower. It means you need to get onto the ground and engage, or at least support and engage individuals on the ground while you support with other elements to ensure that those individuals, those entities or grassroots organizations engage young people in a particular type of way. And we can just look at some of the key principles of what is important. So if we are hoping to make a change in any community, and I live by this particular principle, is that it's really about understanding young people are at where they're at in terms of their language, their cultures, those subcultures, those mentalities, whether they're positive or toxic, understanding where young people are at in real time, understanding young people in terms of their fashion, their trends and their traits. Now, some may say, well, what's important with all of that? But one of the key things as a youth worker, the moment a young person says to me, you don't understand me, already I'm not on their page. And I say that that is important, that we understand young people through their lens. Going back to my point about reflexivity, it's really key that we understand young people in terms of their fashion. But this is where we come in terms of our bigger understanding, because as I said, I kept using the word intellect. I think I said it about 4 times. And this is about knowledge, but I put knowledge into a number of categories. Knowledge of the agenda. Do you know what's currently happening with children and young people with the pieces of literature that I just mentioned earlier on in the slides? Do you have grassroots knowledge of the areas that you've all just mentioned in the beginning when Ben asked the question, where are you from? Do you have grassroots knowledge on who's on the ground? So you shouldn't be asking me in your own area what organizations are out there to engage with young people, because that's your homework to do. That's what you should be doing, finding out who's on the ground and who's doing what. Do you understand the areas? Do you understand the conflicts that exist within those areas? Do you understand those histories, those families that may be connected to a range of things? Do you know the interventions that have been not so successful, but interventions that are effective? Now, I always say to professionals, are you utilizing social media just like young people use social media? but utilizing social media as a form, as a counter narrative to actually interact and network with individuals that are like-minded nationally. So like with the work that Ben's doing through these types of conferences, it enables us to connect and find out who's ultimately doing what. But what are the boundaries? Because with these types of pieces of work that we do, especially working with young people that are affected by violence, it has a series of boundaries. But we also have to talk about credibility and how do we get credibility in our local community. It's about visibility. It's about utilizing platforms to ensure that children and young people, families, communities, whether locally or nationally, are very clear about our work. Social capital, not about who we know, but what do we know with the individuals that we know. So it's not just about signposting children, young people and their families without having the understanding of who those organizations are and what those entities ultimately do. So that means that people need to do their homework, and this is my biggest frustration with a lot of individuals that are putting out and rolling out these pieces of funding, because even those entities don't do their homework. So if you're looking at individuals that write the best bid, unfortunately, that's not, in my opinion, the best practice. What you should be doing is doing research to find out what organizations are on the ground that actually have a portfolio of work to engage with young people, children, families in a range of different ways that are effective. We also have to understand as well that a lot of our work is gendered. That when we're talking about young people that are hyper-masculine, hyper-feminine, and engaging in a range of different ways, our interventions and strategies sometimes require females and require males, and sometimes those intersections between the two. But we also have to understand legislation and policy and what is up to date. So again, it's important that we have up-to-date reading. And this is not for me to say at the end of this session, you need to be reading loads of books and reports. But even if you pick up those reports that I've just mentioned earlier on in the webinar and just look at the executive summary, just to kind of get a taste and an idea of what the position is of the author that's ultimately writing. And then managing conflicts, not just conflicts that we engage with in the community, but our internal conflicts, our issues, what are our trigger points, what are the things that get me angry, what are the things that get you angry. Now, I hate bullies, so I know that when I engage with children and young people that happen to be bullies, I have to be very reflexive in my practice, because again, many people are passionate, but we don't have the intellect, and I say we in a wider sense, we don't have the intellect to connect our understanding in current times to engage with children and young people. So that is me in conclusion. I hope, Ben, that was short and sweet. I know that I've probably gone over probably 5 minutes or so. My phone dropped, so I wasn't able to see it. But if anybody wants to, I guess, look at some of the research that I've done around this particular area, you're more than welcome to click and find out, and we can keep the conversation going.
Craig, that was incredible. I mean, normally what you do that in a couple of hours. So to do that in 40 to 45 minutes is mad. We've got about 10 minutes left, and because we've got another session starting at 2:15 around parenting and isolation, parenting in isolation. So just some questions, and it was amazing, and you can see through the chats, Craig, how people are appreciative. We've got 99 people in here. There's some questions coming up, so I'm just going to pick out a few. This one came in early. How would I be able to ensure my competency is where it needs to be in the year 2020?
Say the question again, sorry, Ben.
How would I be able to ensure that my competency, so I'm assuming that just like where they're at in terms of working with young people, because you mentioned what you can do what you did in 2005 with the type of information you're getting in 2005 might not be relevant in 2020.
Staying up to date. So I'll just follow my practice. I'm always on YouTube. I'm always on Instagram. I'm always online finding out what the trends are amongst children and young people. And our biggest thing is that we actually have young people to ask the question. I know everybody on here has a niece, a nephew, a cousin, a neighbor that they can talk to. And when these kind of questions come in, I think we kind of forget that young people are actually our best teachers. So if someone wants to say, how do I stay relevant? I stay relevant based on the connections that I have with young people that live in my local community.
Okay, that's really helpful. Linda's got about 3 questions here, so I'm just going to choose one. What this is the second part of the question. And what are we doing in prisons regarding education? That program about university education in New York prisons was eye-opening. So I think there's the questions about, you know, we talk about rehabilitation in prisons, but
Yes.
you know, what is really happening around education in prisons, and how can they be improved?
Well, the bigger challenge is the system, and I think it's important to understand what prison is, and what prison's supposed to do. So prisons, well, we pay taxes for punishment and rehabilitation, and we know that we get more punishment than rehabilitation. So before we even talk about education, we have to also talk about the fundamentals that are flawed. So if you've got individuals that are in prison that are traumatized, putting them in an educational program actually is not ready. Individuals are not ready for that, because they actually need to have a psychological assessment to see where they're at. So if I was working with young people in that context, rather than giving them, before I even attempt to give them skills that are ultimately going to benefit them when they come home, the foundations about identity, the foundations about one's masculinity, femininity, one's understanding about trigger points, rage, trauma, because those are the things that are really important. Problem is, however, is that the prison system don't resource those things. So that's why it's flawed. It's almost like saying that you're sending kids to the educational system, but it's very Eurocentric, and we're expecting those children to then come out that are different, to be individuals that have a well-rounded understanding of contributing to the world. So we need to start fundamentally engaging with the systemic problems like racism, like sexism, like all of those issues that exist within society, before we even talk about what education looks like. So what we need is a paradigm shift, in conclusion, to what's happening.
Right. There was a question which wasn't on the Q&A about how do we keep musicians accountable to some of the stuff which is coming out, artists.
We don't leave them behind. Rather than just naming and shaming them, I say we don't leave them behind. We let them know that their content oftentimes is toxic and it fuels what goes on in the community. But I don't think it stops there. This links to the last point I just mentioned. We have to also talk about the systemic problems, because we can't talk about artists before we talk about the record labels and generally the individuals that are cultural vultures that exist within the community, like your Tim Westwoods, like your Charlie Slough. And interestingly enough, none of them are black. So they put out toxic messages in our community, and the custodians are generally black and Asian men. And oftentimes those black and Asian men are oftentimes ones that are blamed for the issues that exist within our communities. I'm not suggesting that those individuals shouldn't be held accountable, but let's start to address the elephant in the room. So when we now talk about, like what Ben is saying, let's talk about race, let's just start talking about race again for a moment. Let's talk about cultural appropriation. So before we talk about education, let's talk about systemic racism. Let's talk about institutional racism. Let's talk about every institution across the UK. There is a glass ceiling of individuals that look like me or people of difference only stop at certain levels, and the CEOs, the directors at certain levels, one, do not look like the people of difference that they're serving, or they want individuals to buy their particular products. And most importantly, they're not even connected to those particular things. So I think that we need to probably start asking newer questions. And I think that we're in a really interesting time where people are now starting to give their ears now to say, well, what is the problem? Because we've done writing reports. Now we're talking about systematic change. We're talking about paradigm shifts. And I think whilst we keep talking about the flaws in education, the prison system, and we ignore the elephant in the room, I think that's the fundamental problem. We need to start getting comfortable now talking about race.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. What I would suggest, if people want to listen a little bit more to what Craig is saying, he blessed us, Power to Fight, with 3 power talks on our website. And if you go onto our website, I mean, I think it's about maybe over 2 hours worth of content that you've blessed us with. And he talks a lot about this kind of music and street life issue. Talks a lot about cultural competent therapy, a lot of things that we're very passionate about here at Power to Fight. So I would say just go onto our website, powertofight.org.uk, go to our Power Talks, and you'll see 3 Power Talks from Craig there. And I've time for one more question, and I think it does link to what you've just said there about this system change. but an anonymous attendee has said, how do we prove that grassroots work? And I think it's a great question, because so often you find yourself in this situation where we know that some of the organizations who are getting the big money, the big contracts, are not the ones who are actually culturally competent. They're not the ones who are on the ground, and they're not the ones who the communities respect. But often the smaller organizations, because they're maybe not registered charities, they're not limited companies, they're just doing the work, don't necessarily get the funding. How do we prove, how do we help, how do we make sure that grassroots actually work and get the amplification which is needed?
I think one of the things is about, again, paradigm shift. And I think this is the bigger problem that we're ultimately faced with. And it's something of which I believe is not going to happen overnight. You know, if we talk about kind of a public health model in context of where we're going to try and get change, as organization, we need to kind of have that same type of thinking that's joined up. So having things like consortiums that kind of lobby particular types of groups and audiences for funding. And I think many of us that kind of sit on a lot of expert panels that are close to individuals that give funding, I think we need to make our arguments more connected and stronger. Prior to this webinar, I had a conversation locally with an issue happening within the West Midlands. And that was the conversation that if we are trying to get systemic change, we need to have a joined up conversation as opposed to individual entities and organizations. And I guess this is part of the problem as well, because the system set us up to be divided. You know, there's only a little bit of funding, so I don't want to work with Ben on this one because I'm not going to get the finance in order to do that. And that was designed for a particular type of reason, that it will always keep us in a situation where we're not going to unify because of finance, because ultimately that finance and that economic system is ultimately that's going to enable us to provide for our families. So we can't be radical without thinking about the fundamental principles, looking at things like politics, looking at economics, and how those things contribute to the issues that we're ultimately faced with. So I say, as professionals, we need to talk more economics, we need to talk more politics, because I think that these are some of the founding things that ultimately that we've kind of lost. And what I mean by kind of lost is that we focus so much on the intervention and how the intervention works and the money to get the intervention, but we don't think about things like economic wealth locally in our communities, charity organizations that, you know, churches give out millions a year to aid, you know, mosques give out millions a year to aid, but we don't really think about, well, if we was to kind of convince some of those charity organizations that give out 174 million out of the country, imagine if they kept 8 million of the 78 million out the country.
Listen, the Church of England alone, and you can, this is a Google search, they are sitting on 8.3 billion worth of investments.
Well, there you have it. But then we're asking local government for 30 grand to do $5 billion problems.
And that's the thing. So I think what you've just said there is really important. Collaboration, partnership, really think about, I mean, this is one of the biggest ethos things around Power to Fight. Our ethos is that we collaborate, we partner, we support, we engage, and we do something which we don't see too often, which is really actually, let's bring the best practitioners, not necessarily the ones who've got the biggest platforms, together. So I think if we can do more of that, then we'll find ourselves in a really good situation. We're going to close this now because in 15 minutes, we've got our 6th session, which is, if I can just find it. Yeah, there it is. It's parenting in isolation, which I think for many of us in this time of lockdown is going to be a really vital one. It's done by a doctor, clinical psychologist, John Reese. It's going to be really good. So you should have got the link already. Craig, I want to say thank you very much. Brilliant as always. You can find Craig on, well, just give us your social media handles very quickly, bro.
So the easy way to just probably get me, you just get me on Real Action UK, Twitter, LinkedIn, always the best way to get me.
Lovely. And just to say, Power to Fight, we are a charity. So if you do feel like you would like to give and support us to do more of this type of work and various other things, any information, you can just go into our website, www.powertofight.org.uk, and you can see how we can support. Hopefully I'll see you in the next session. Craig, thank you very much, and we'll speak soon. Take care.
Peace.